series where I dropped a new true crime video every other day the entire month of June. So, there is a ton of new content over on Patreon, and you also get access to like every video that I've ever released on Patreon for only $5 a month. So I would love it if you joined us over there. Check out the link for that, and yeah, let's get into our case today. Our case today takes place in Vaughn, Mississippi in November of 2003. And Vaughn is this super small farming community about 30 minutes outside of Jackson. And for most people living in Vaughn, the social activities revolve around churches, front porches, and pitchers of sweet tea. It is a very quiet, very rural area, and it was the home of the Hargon family. And the Harkins were a very established family in Vaughn. They owned hundreds of acres of property and cattle, and they had owned property and cattle, and it had been passed down from generation to generation. The newest generation of Hargons included 26-year-old Michael, his wife, 29-year-old Rebecca, and their 3-year-old son, James Patrick. Michael and Rebecca had begun dating in high school, and it was really kind of love at a first sight for them. And they dated up until they got married. And at the time of our story, Michael was working in construction, and Rebecca worked part-time as a physical therapy assistant. One member of the family described Rebecca saying, quote, "She was like an angel sent from heaven. She was always loving and willing to help." The family was a typical Southern family. They were happy and loving, and they were described on an episode of My Family's Deadly Secret as being welcoming to anyone. They would literally help anyone who needed it. Michael and Rebecca celebrated Christmas that year with the extended Hargon family, and it was a magical Christmas. But behind all the smiles, there was this underlying tension, because Michael's mom had recently been diagnosed with cancer. A few months later, on Valentine's Day actually, in 2004, a neighbor noticed something off at the Hargon home. Now remember, this is a super small town, and everyone knows everyone else, and they really look out for each other. So this neighbor drives by Rebecca and Michael's house and sees that Michael's truck is parked outside where it normally is, but the truck door is open. And this, in and of itself, may have not been super suspicious, but the neighbor also notices that the front door is wide open. So, the neighbor calls Michael's aunt, because everyone knows everyone and everyone's phone numbers. And Michael's aunt drives to the house to see if everything's okay. freezer. It was all still at the home. The 3-year-old suffered from horrible asthma, and it was alarming to police because they realized he wouldn't be able to survive for long without his medications. So police knew that they had to find this family quick. And they also knew, or at least suspected, due to the amount of blood found at the scene, that it was likely that at least one of the family members were already dead. So this massive search was launched to try and locate the family. The property where the family lived was searched, and it was like acres and acres of pastures, and they looked through everything but found nothing. The homes in this area were miles and miles apart from each other. There's just so much open land. The news of the missing Hargon family swept through the small town, and Michael's extended family all gathered to support each other and wait and pray for good news. Several law enforcement agencies were busy working the case, trying to find the family as quickly as possible. They were trying to piece together a timeline of events in the days leading up to the disappearances, and they found that the family had been home on the Friday, the evening of February 13th, which was the Friday before, and they knew the family had rodeo tickets for the next night, which would have been Saturday, but they went missing that morning. Police were really interested to see if they had any enemies, but no one could think of any. They were just a very quiet, keep to yourself kind of family. They were involved in anything illegal. They had no enemies. They didn't have any outrageous loans or anything like that. By the next morning, the missing persons case on the Harkins family had been classified as missing and endangered, and police were busy pouring through the contacts. Basically anyone who ever came in contact with the family. They wanted to talk to people who they worked with, who they hung out with socially, anyone who babysat James Patrick. They wanted to find anyone who may have had a motive to hurt this family. And through this process, police found out something pretty shocking. Okay, so 10 years before Michael, Rebecca, and James Patrick were taken, in April of 1994, there had been a murder inside the very home that the family was living in when they disappeared. Back then, Michael's father actually owned a store, and the house was a store back in 94, and he was killed in an armed robbery. And eventually, the store closed down and they turned it into a home, and then Michael moved into it with his wife. Okay, so the Hargon family, they're just working class farmers. They didn't live extravagant lifestyles or have the nicest things, but they did have hundreds of acres of land. But an armed robbery in this super small, sleepy town in rural Mississippi, it was strange. Michael's father, Dan Haywood Hargon, who was just 42 years old, was shot and killed his sons would be home. And police, this was like too much of a coincidence. They could not rule out that these two crimes were connected. And it's like I say in true crime, a coincidence isn't a coincidence usually when it comes to true crime. So police have these two very violent crimes in the exact same location, happening to the exact same family in a sleepy rural Mississippi town. And this raised a lot of red flags. Now, the three men who had killed Dan Haywood Hargon were caught and convicted. And police actually found out that just 3 days before the Hargon family went missing, one of the armed robbers had been up for parole. And Michael had been at that hearing and had spoken out against the man, getting paroled. The man's parole was denied. And when police find out this information, they begin to believe that maybe the disappearance of Michael's family was some sort of retaliation for Michael's testimony at the hearing. But then they find something that points them in a completely different direction. They find out that Michael had recently come into an inheritance from his late Uncle Charles Hargon. And they began to wonder if maybe this inheritance was motive for the crime. So they bring in Ernest Lee Hargon, who is Michael's cousin, and his wife Lisa for questioning, because Ernest was the one who had been written out of his father's will, and then Michael had become the sole beneficiary. So instead of leaving his son the inheritance, he left everything to his nephew Michael. And police are like, this is the motive we've been looking for. Ernest was described as a hard ass. He was a cowboy. He worked cattle and hauled cattle, and he had a bit of a temper. Ernest had been adopted by Charles Hargon, and he had raised him as his own son. But Ernest didn't get along with his father, and he had cut ties years ago. At the time that father and son were not getting along and kind of cut ties, Ernest's life had really begun to unravel. He was in his 40s, and he had become addicted to crystal meth, which he used to stay awake during his long hauls, when he's hauling cattle, his long trips. The addiction led to multiple arguments with his father, and they basically became estranged. But then Charles' health began to fade, and he tried in vain to kind of reestablish a relationship with his son, basically begging him to come talk to him and come visit him. But Ernest was very stubborn and he refused. So Charles decided to cut out his son from his will and leave everything to his nephew Michael, who he had a wonderful relationship with, and this was done just weeks before he died. Had he not made this super last minute change, Ernest would have been the person to inherit his father's estate, which included a 50-acre cattle farm. So Ernest and Lisa are brought in. They alibied each other, saying they had been actually had the stomach flu the entire weekend. And police were skeptical, but Ernest seemed super forthcoming. He agreed to help investigators. He spoke with police. He didn't seem nervous or suspicious at all. In fact, it was quite the opposite. He was like very calm, and he readily agreed to help in any way he could, including submitting voluntarily to a polygraph. Again, police noted during his polygraph that he was calm and collected, and he did not seem nervous at all. The results of the polygraph were inconclusive, but it reportedly was leaning more toward him being honest. Like, they did not believe he was lying. Police didn't eliminate him as a suspect, but they did start to try to chase down other leads because this just didn't seem to be their guy. Detectives had been chasing down information about the 3 men who had killed Michael's father 10 years before. They were looking into their contacts outside of prison. Anyone they spoke to on the phone, wrote to, people who visited them, basically anyone who had any kind of communication with these people were looked into. And according to police, there was just no indication that the men who had killed Michael's father were involved in his family's disappearance. According to police, there was no indication the men involved in the crime had any idea who had attended or testified at that parole hearing. So police continued to chase down leads, but nothing helpful was coming up. In the meantime, the community of Vaughn really stepped up. They organized searches. They distributed over 60,000 missing persons flyers. They held candlelight vigils to try and keep attention on the case. And a tip line was set up, and tips began to flood in. One tipster called in reporting that they had seen a white van in the area of the Hargon home. In the hours the police believed the family had been taken. It was described as a white paneled work van, and it was very near the home in the hours that police were giving the public. Police began chasing down every white van in Mississippi, trying to find the driver of this van. But eventually, police determined that it was actually just some workers in the area who happened to be driving by the Hargon home at the time the crime occurred, and they were not involved in any way. At this point, police felt like they were really chasing their tails until someone walked right into the police station and delivered a bombshell that turned the entire case upside down. Lisa Hargon, so this is Ernest Lee's wife, just showed up at the police station one day and said, "Hey, I wasn't with Ernest the morning of Valentine's Day, and we were not sick that whole weekend. In fact, they had gone to dinner to celebrate Valentine's Day. And by that evening, the town was already abuzz at the news of the missing Harkins." And so Lisa brought up the family being missing to Ernest, because she knew he was furious over being written out of his father's will, and he just didn't want to talk about it. She kept bringing it up and trying to push, but he did not want to talk about it at all. She kept bringing it up and really trying to push him to talk about it, and finally he admitted that he had gone to Michael's home earlier that morning she's being truthful. Remember that hat that they found at the crime scene that smelled awful, but nobody could place the smell? Well, she was able to explain the smell. First of all, she told them that he did leave a hat behind, and he knew he did. And then she told them about the smell. So she worked as a veterinarian assistant, and she loved animals so much that she actually had a pet monkey. So the smell was like monkey, I guess. After Lisa's confession, police headed to Ernest's home. They wanted him in custody before he realized that his wife was cooperating with authorities. Ernest surrendered to police when they showed up, and he went with them, but he was chillingly calm. His home was searched, where police found ammunition casings. There were even casings found on his windshield, and they were a match to the casings found in Michael's home. Ernest's property was searched because they were thinking maybe the family was somewhere on the property, but nothing was found. 3 days after his arrest, Ernest was in court for his preliminary hearing, and at this point, police had still not found the family, and they were worried that if they were being held somewhere, and he wasn't there to feed them and care for them, that they would die. So they decide, in order to get him talking, they're gonna pull a fast one on him. But they need to bring in Lisa to help, and she agrees. Police approach Ernest, and they tell him that Lisa's being charged with the murder of Michael, Rebecca, and James. And upon hearing this, he's like, no, my wife has nothing to do with this. I'll tell you everything. You have to drop the charges against her. And then he just starts talking. Ernest said that he arrived at Michael's home and he was infuriated over being cut out of the will. See, while the Hargon family had been very prosperous, there weren't very many members of the family left alive. So besides Michael and his son James Patrick, they were kind of the only people to carry on the Hargon name. So he drove to Michael's house early the morning of February 14th, and he arrived before daylight. According to Ernest, Michael slipped on his boots and answered the door because his son was still asleep. The two argued, and Michael tried to run to his truck to get his gun. But Ernest shot him right in front of the truck, and Michael was shot in the face. And this lined up with forensics because several teeth had been found on the ground in the blood by the truck. Ernest Lee admitted to shooting Michael with a .22 caliber pistol. Then he said his adrenaline really kicked in and he just began stalking through the house looking for the rest of Michael's family. He wanted them all dead so he would get the inheritance. He found Rebecca and shot her in the arm, and then he choked her until she passed out. He also strangled James Patrick until he passed out. Then he threw Michael's body across the back seats of his 1974 Corvette and put Rebecca and then James Patrick on top of Rebecca, and he took off. He said he drove 100 miles to his Taylorsville farm. He ditched the pistol along the way, and when they arrived at the farm, Rebecca and James Patrick were still alive. So he strangled them again, this time until they died. Rebecca died with her child in her arms. He then piled isolated field where he buried them in a shallow grave together. So police, using this hand-drawn map that Ernest had made, quickly went out to recover the bodies. One investigator said they were buried with their arms all around each other, like they had just been sleeping together. Every single person at the scene had tears in their eyes when the family was dug up. Michael's mother, who had been publicly begging for a safe return of her family, was heartbroken. And once she found out they were dead at the hands of Ernest, she told the news, quote, "He may have the Hargon name, but he has no Hargon blood running through his veins," end quote. She was very sick at this point, battling colon cancer, and she vowed to save her strength to attend Ernest's trial. But she died 1 month before it began. Ernest Lee Hargon was sentenced to death by lethal injection for the murders of Michael, Rebecca, and James Patrick Hargon. But he didn't get to sit on death row for years and years while he waited to exhaust his appeals. He was stabbed to death in prison 1 year later by a fellow inmate while he was at the Mississippi State Penitentiary. The district attorney said of Ernest's murder, quote, "I thought pretty much that Ernest Lee got what he deserved, and the type of death had been appropriate for the pain he had inflicted. I'm not encouraging anyone to do that, but I'm not sad that it happened." And I absolutely love that the district attorney said that. I don't know if that's an only in Mississippi can the district attorney say that, but I loved when I read that quote, so I had to include it here. Lisa Hargon was never charged with her part. Well, she didn't have a part of it, but she initially withheld information from police. And today, Michael and Rebecca Hargon's home sits empty, surrounded by barbed wire to keep the vandals and gawkers away. On a recent afternoon, the place was eerily still. A large hawk swooped down into the dead grass behind the home, the leaves of a few cedar trees, the only green in the dull winter landscape. It's like a giant cemetery monument to the family who lost their lives. Over 50 acres of land. That is the murder of the Hargon family. I came across this case. I was researching cases for Cruel Summer over on Patreon, and I was trying to get cases that no one had ever heard of, and I came upon this case. I don't think it's been covered. I've never heard of it. So anyway, yeah. Super sad case. Karma definitely reared its head in this case. Thank you guys so much for joining me. Please check out Patreon. I would love to have you join us over there. And I'll see you next week.